Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of Side Projects. This one's all about abandoned, incredible monuments to communism. I have a personal story. It's probably not going to appear in today's video because it was demolished. I was on a road trip with a friend of mine. I believe we were in Croatia, and we were like, let's go see this giant abandoned communist monument in the middle of nowhere. So we drove out to the middle of nowhere. Hours.
Only to find out that it had been demolished.
And then we accidentally locked our car keys in the car in the middle of nowhere, and we had to break the window to get them. Yeah, great story, Whistle Boy. And now today's video. Of all the major historical events of the 20th century, the Russian Revolution and the establishment of the USSR was the one that reverberated the most. The 20th century was defined both by and against communism, from fascist dictators leveraging fear of it for their own ends to democratic countries clamping down on it. And of course, World War II, the largest clash between ideologies ever seen. Today, communism is gone for the most part, with the world 30 years removed from the dissolution of the Soviet Union. But ideology doesn't exist for most of a century without leaving behind some legacies. And in the formerly communist countries of the Eastern Bloc, there are dozens of once proud monuments that, with the end of the Cold War, have largely fallen into disrepair. Even so, they still stand, reminders of the not-so-distant past. These are the stories of some of the forgotten monuments to communism. Our first entry in this video takes us to the country of Bulgaria. Bulgaria had, during the Second World War, joined forces with Germany in order to take on the Soviet Union. That particular gamble failed, and Bulgaria was subsequently occupied by the USSR and turned into a communist satellite state. But communism in Bulgaria went further back than the Soviet occupation. Specifically, in 1891, a group of socialist revolutionaries led by Dimitar Blagoev met on the peak of a mountain named Buzludza to make plans for a socialist government in Bulgaria. To that end, they founded the Bulgarian Social Democratic Party, the first socialist party to be established in the Balkans. Following the end of World War II, the successors of that communist party were put into power by Stalin. Some 20 years after that, the leaders of that party realized that the whole communism thing wasn't that popular with the average person, and they decided that they needed to do something to keep people on board. And what better way to do that than by reveling in the past? To that end, a decision was taken by the Central Committee on March the 11th, 1971, to build a monument on the same peak where those revolutionaries had first met. Construction began in 1974 and it was finished in 1981. Interestingly, this monument was funded entirely with donations at a cost of 14.2 million Bulgarian lev. Now, we did try to find out how much that was in modern US dollars, but A, this was 40 years ago, and B, the Bulgarian lev is not a very popular currency. So, to answer the question, how much money is that, we're probably just going to answer with a lot. The monument itself is impressive from the outside, a large circular structure with a tall tower in the back. But when it was completed, the interior was where the real attention was given. Over 60 artists took part in the interior design, creating frescoes, paintings, and decorative art pieces showing various socialist themes, the most striking of which is the hammer and sickle panel in the center of the main hall ceiling. The Bulgarian Communist Party liked this monument so much that they actually held annual meetings there, which, hey, at least meant it was used for something. But that didn't last, as communism ended in Bulgaria in 1989, and it suddenly didn't make sense to pay for the upkeep of a communist monument. Following that change, the monument fell into disrepair surprisingly quickly, and today the photos of the dilapidated and graffitied interior are strikingly symbolic of communism's fall from power. The monument itself is currently sitting in bureaucratic limbo. At one point, the Bulgarian government attempted to just give the monument to the Bulgarian Communist Party because why not, but some legal snafu made that impossible to implement. You might be surprised to learn that the BCP actually still holds party gatherings in the area of the monument, despite it being more than 30 years removed from the last communist government. Our next entry on the list takes us to the village of Podgorica in Croatia. Here, in the year 1941, in what was then the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, a group of communist guerrilla fighters established a base of operations from which to fight against the Axis countries who were occupying the country at the time. In the forests around the region, there were several field hospitals for rebel fighters. In the 4 years of the resistance movement between 1941 and 1945, around 900 fighters were killed and buried in this area. The Yugoslav partisans, as they were were known, are considered to have been the most effective resistance movement in Axis-occupied Europe. Yugoslavia had the distinction of largely liberating itself without the aid of the Soviet Red Army. Following the end of the war, Yugoslavia was established as a fully communist country under the leadership of strongman Josip Broz Tito, who had been leading that resistance. Throughout the Cold War, Tito's leadership was basically the only thing holding Yugoslavia together, and one of the ways that he did this was through national prestige. This involved things like winning sports competitions and, of course, large monuments. One of those monuments was commissioned in 1965 to honor and remember the sacrifices made by the soldiers in Moslavina 20 years prior. The Yugoslav sculptor Dusan Jajmoja was hired to make the monument, and he took 2 years to set it up. The final product was a concrete and aluminium monument around 10 meters tall and 20 meters wide. It's a brutalist movement, since brutalism was all the rage in communist countries. But on top of that, there's a certain abstractness to its design that's absent from other monuments. I mean, what's it supposed to be? One description is that the center of the sculpture represents the Earth and the side wings represent victory in World War II, but there are other interpretations, such as a bird ready to fly or victory of life over death. In short, it's open to interpretation, which is generally rare for brutalist architecture. The monument still stands today, but is understandably less of a draw than it used to be. Even so, it's in remarkably good shape, all things considered, and it remains quite the standout piece. Okay, so we're heading to the other side of Europe for this one, and we must admit that we're rather bending the rules with this entry. Grutas Park, as it is known, is a collection of monuments rather than one monument on its own, and it really isn't forgotten, and it also isn't much of a monument to communism than to the pain and misery that resulted from it. So let's give some backstory. The Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were annexed by the USSR way back in the early 1940s, and they remained part of that country until its collapse in 1991. They were not particularly eager participants, to put it mildly. As such, the memory of communism in these countries is less rosy than it is in, say, Russia. Whatever the case, following the end of the Cold War and the independence of the Baltic states, Lithuania in particular found itself with a dilemma. There were dozens of statues around the country dedicated to prominent figures of communism, from Karl Marx to Vladimir Lenin to Joseph Stalin, and there was a heated debate about what to do with them now that Lithuania was ex-Soviet and ex-communist. Lithuanian citizens took it upon themselves to start tearing down the statues, and it was decided that the government would take all the statues and place them into storage. There they remained until some years later, when a businessman named Vilnius Malinauskas asked the government to give the statues to him so that he could open a private museum park in which to display them. A rather odd request, but one that was ultimately granted despite considerable controversy, probably because the government didn't like spending money on these old statues anymore. Malinauskas received the statues in 1999 and set up his park, yet this park isn't for glorification, rather quite the opposite. The statues are arranged in separate spheres, as the museum calls them, and see if you could spot the trend in how they're named. The totalitarian sphere includes sculptures of communist leaders like Lenin and Stalin. The terror sphere contained sculptures of the men who founded the Communist Party of Lithuania, as well as officers of the Red Army. The occupation and death spheres highlights individuals who organize mass deportations or the suppression of political dissidents, and so on. So yes, you can imagine that Stalin and co. wouldn't be all that thrilled about their inclusion in the park. In addition to the aptly named sections, there are also such appropriate landmarks as guard towers and barbed wire fences to give the impression that one really is walking through a Siberian gulag. In fact, Malinauskas originally planned to have visitors arrive in cattle cars to sell just that experience, but that particular plan was thankfully shot down. The park remains open to this day, and it does still inspire some controversial discussions among Lithuanians over whether these statues should be displayed in this way, given the history that they represent, and arguments that might sound familiar to an American audience. With that being said, Grutas Park does seem to offer a compromise between displaying such monuments publicly and doing away with them entirely, and they are at least contextualized properly. And of course, no one can accuse the park of glorifying communism, since there's both an entrance fee and a gift shop. We should acknowledge at this point that this list was rather Eurocentric. That's largely because in other parts of the world, disavowed communist monuments are difficult to find. China and North Korea, for example, have plenty of communist monuments, but you can't really call those forgotten since, well, those countries are still communist. Even so, this was by no means a comprehensive list, so let's just end it off with a bit of quickfire stuff. There is, for example, a statue of Lenin in Tajikistan, which was relegated to an empty field, and where the advice for visitors is to watch out for cows. There's the Russian-Georgia Friendship Monument, erected in 1983, which rings rather hollow since Russia invaded the country of Georgia in 2008. And lastly, there's another statue of Lenin in Odessa, Ukraine, which in 2015 was subsequently turned into a statue of who else than Darth Vader. So I really hope you found this video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching. Hello there, yes, I'm still here just to give a quick plug at the end of today's video to something new that I'm working on called Into the Shadows. It's a brand new channel from me, and if the name doesn't give it away, it's very much focused on the darker side of things. Early episodes have covered things such as how we fight the world's deadliest disease, how the Congo suffered the worst of colonialism, and how the Nazis escaped Europe to South America. So if you'd like to explore the darker side of history and science and humanity, please check out Into the Shadows. There is a link below, and goodbye for now.